So, have you ever looked at election results and just wondered, why do voters keep choosing bad economic policies, even when the data overwhelmingly proves those policies just don't work? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating debate happening right now among classical liberal economists. It all centers around that deeply frustrating question for anyone who loves facts and figures. We're going to explore this through the lens of a recent podcast discussion and a brilliant rebuttal essay that diagnoses exactly where the communication completely breaks down.
This whole debate kicks off with a super exasperated quote from economist Anthony Davies on the Kibbe on Liberty podcast. He, along with host Matt Kibbe and co-host James Harrigan, are just incredibly frustrated. From their perspective, the math is totally sound, the historical data completely correct. And yet, decade after decade, politicians propose the exact same flawed economic ideas, and voters just keep right on supporting them, repeating the exact same economic mistakes.
But then, essayist Cassandra Jackson responds to this podcast with a really sharp, profound critique. Jackson argues that the economists keep losing because, well, they fundamentally misunderstand human nature. As she puts it, people don't internalize data, they internalize harm. And she points out that it's actually entirely rational for people to reject policies that totally ignore their lived reality. Her argument is that economists keep explaining the technical mechanics of an economic problem, but they never stop to actually acknowledge the human injury it caused.
Let's look at mechanism versus acknowledgement.
This communication breakdown perfectly illustrates what we call the empathy gap. You see, economists naturally default to explaining the mechanism, like exactly how inflation transfers wealth. But voters, they don't hear mechanisms. They hear the harm and the injustice they are actively living through. Jackson lays out a really brilliant framework here. Winning an argument means explaining the mechanism, sure, but winning a vote requires making that person feel seen in their pain. Let's look at some historical case studies from the sources to see how this actually plays out.
Let's start with the 1980s farm crisis. To really grasp this disconnect, we have to look back to the early 1980s. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates to a staggering 20% to kill stagflation. Now, classical economics dictates this was the exact correct mechanism, and hey, the data absolutely backs it up. It successfully lowered inflation from 13% all the way down to 3%. So economists point to this as a textbook success story.
But the human reality on the ground, it was absolutely catastrophic. Because of those 20% interest rates, 250,000 rural farmers who held variable rate loans suddenly couldn't service their debt. Between 1980 and 1985, they lost multi-generational family land at auction. Just think about that. Entire livelihoods completely wiped out in a matter of years.
The economist looks at this and sees a necessary adjustment for long-term stability. And technically speaking, they're right. But the farmer who just lost their grandfather's land, they aren't acting irrationally when they ignore that macroeconomic logic. Not at all. They're making a totally rational choice to vote for the only politician who actually looks them in the eye and acknowledges that Washington destroyed their livelihood.
Moving on to redlining and the 2008 financial crisis.
This exact pattern of missing the human element repeats itself when we look at systematic exclusion. According to the Brookings Institution, Black families lost $212 billion in wealth across 40 years. This was due to deliberate exclusion from the housing market by the government, a practice known as redlining. $212 billion. That is a massive, measurable loss of generational wealth.
Now, economists correctly identify this as a textbook failure of government intervention distorting the free market. But Jackson points out that sterile academic explanations of market inefficiency completely fail to validate deliberate injustice. When a system strips you of wealth, being told it's just a market failure feels deeply patronizing, right? To the communities affected, it felt like a system actively designed to keep them poor. And this compounded during the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. Families who were finally getting access to credit were steered into predatory loans. When the market inevitably crashed, a median Black family watched their home equity plummet from $100,000 down to just $47,000. That wealth just evaporated into thin air.
Once again, we see the exact same disconnect. The economists accurately cite moral hazard, arguing that the government should have just let the banks fail to teach the market a lesson. But, it is entirely rational for the victims of this crisis to vote for the politician who matches their anger. They want acknowledgement of the sheer unfairness that banks got bailed out while they lost everything. They definitely don't want to lecture on moral hazard.
Let's bring this to the present: inflation and everyday pain. We can apply this exact same framework to something affecting everyone right now:
The inflation of the 2020s. The data shows massive spikes in everyday costs over just 4 years. Groceries are up 25%, which costs a family earning $50,000 an extra $3,000 a year. Rent is up 30%. Gas prices have wildly fluctuated, trapping rural workers in incredibly expensive commutes. In their podcast, Kibbe and Davies attribute this directly to the government running massive deficits and printing money during the COVID pandemic.
But here's the thing. When an economist goes on television and quotes the quantity theory of money, they instantly lose the working class voter. That voter just wants someone to admit that their family is basically being robbed by the system to the tune of $3,000 a year. They want the harm named. They do not care about the economic theory behind it.
Anthony Davies points out that this is actually a repeating historical cycle. Roughly every 10 years, there's a massive emergency. The government declares a crisis, deficit spends to fix it, and the resulting economic shocks always roll downhill to the voters. And get this, they are already predicting the next crisis in the 2030s will be Social Security insolvency.
Which brings us to the war is good for the economy fallacy.
This connects to a specific policy debate mentioned in the sources, the proposal from some politicians to massively increase the defense budget to stimulate the American economic engine. It's that old argument that war and weapon manufacturing is somehow good for the economy. The podcasters counter this military Keynesianism using classical economics, specifically the broken window fallacy. Yes, breaking a window pays the glazier, but it ignores what the shop owner would have spent that money on otherwise. Maybe buying new shoes for his kids, which would have created jobs elsewhere. They argue this is wildly economically inefficient, even comparing it to Paul Krugman's old joke about faking an alien invasion just to stimulate the economy.
Let's look at acknowledging the human cost.
But Cassandra Jackson argues that telling a factory worker that war spending is an economic fallacy absolutely doesn't work when that weapons factory is literally the only thing putting food on their table right now. To actually win over voters, classical liberals have to follow a sequence. Jackson gives us 5 steps. You must name the harm and specify the people hurt first. You have to make eye contact with the wound and express appropriate anger before you ever earn the right to explain the math and offer a real alternative.
Armed people aren't confused or ignorant when they ignore economic models. They are voting rationally. They vote for the person who promises to see them as human beings. Because as Jackson so profoundly states, managed to spare still requires hope.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on. Economists have the right data, and their math is absolutely flawless. But until they pair that data with genuine empathy, until they recognize that voting for human acknowledgement is a totally rational act, are they doomed to just keep losing the argument forever? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.